They thought he was just another quiet kid in a hoodie, until he solved a problem even PhDs couldn't touch. When a strict professor tried to humiliate him in front of 200 students, he did the unthinkable. But what happened next? No one, not even she, saw it coming. Stay tuned to witness a jaw-dropping academic comeback. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The sun filtered through the high windows of the University of Michigan's math lecture hall, casting faint shadows across rows of anxious students flipping through notes and muttering last-minute formulas under their breath. It was just another Tuesday in Dr. Helen Stokes's advanced calculus class, a course whispered about in dorm hallways with a mix of fear and respect. And at the center of it all was Dr. Stokes herself, sharp-eyed, steel-voiced, and intolerant of error. Her reputation had been forged over decades of brutal pop quizzes, surgical critiques, and a disdain for anything less than intellectual perfection. When she entered the room, heels clicking on the tile like a ticking clock before a storm, conversations died mid-sentence. Today, she was in no mood for softness. "Last week we covered multivariable limits," she said, snapping a piece of chalk between her fingers like it had dared to disappoint her. "Today, Laplace transforms. Let's begin." She turned to the board, and with the grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times, began scrawling an elaborate system of equations. In the middle of the room, a quiet figure sat, arms folded over a clean notebook. Marcus Wynne. Tall, reserved, always in a plain hoodie. Hadn't said a word all semester. He never needed to. Numbers spoke to him, always had. While others struggled to keep up with the notation dancing across the board, Marcus noticed something else. A flaw. Small, subtle, buried in complexity, but a flaw nonetheless. He hesitated. No one else saw it, or if they did, no one dared say it. Then, from the front row, a girl raised her hand. Professor Stokes, I think there might be a mistake in the second line?" Stokes froze mid-chalk. Slowly she turned. "There is no mistake," she said, tone flat as granite. The girl turned scarlet, eyes dropping. Silence returned. And then Marcus lifted his hand. Calmly, deliberately. "Yes," Stokes said, arching an eyebrow. "There's actually a small error," Marcus replied. "The coefficient was applied incorrectly. It throws off the final solution." The room held its breath. Stokes's jaw tensed. "Oh," she said coolly, "then by all means, Mr. Wynne, show us." Marcus stood. He wasn't seeking attention. But Dr. Helen Stokes had no idea what she'd just unleashed. Marcus stepped up to the board with a calm that didn't match the weight of the moment. All eyes followed him. Some were curious, some amused. Others were clearly expecting him to trip over himself in front of the infamously unforgiving Dr. Helen Stokes. She watched with arms folded, that half-smile of hers curling at the corners, half condescension, half challenge. Marcus didn't flinch. He took the chalk from her, erased the flawed transformation, and began to rewrite it, his voice steady as he explained. "You carried the coefficient too early during the Laplace transform," he said. "It changes the domain prematurely, which affects the integral's bounds. This," he tapped the board, "preserves the structure of the original function." His handwriting wasn't polished like hers, but his logic was undeniable. He finished cleanly, underlined the corrected result, and turned back to face the class. Stokes stared at the board for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Fine," she said at last. "You corrected it. Congratulations." No warmth, no praise, just dismissal wrapped in decorum. Marcus didn't blink. He returned to his seat, unfazed by the stares, the whispers. But something had changed. The unspoken balance of power in that classroom had shifted ever so slightly, and Stokes felt it. Which is why she didn't move on. Not yet. "If Mr. Wind is so confident," she said, turning back to the board, "perhaps he wouldn't mind another opportunity to impress us." She began scrawling again, this time writing out a monster of an equation. It stretched nearly the length of the chalkboard. A problem far more complex, filled with multivariate integrals, nonlinear components, and a particularly nasty differential twist at the end. "This," she said, tapping the final symbol, "should be a fair challenge." Marcus looked up at it, then down at his notebook. She wanted to put him in his place. A setup. He knew it. Everyone did. But Marcus stood anyway. A few snickers rippled through the room. Even some of the brightest students had quietly admitted Stokes's challenges were legendary in their cruelty. Marcus picked up the chalk and began. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't about showing off. It was precision. Focus. Each stroke deliberate. Each step unfolding naturally from the last. The room fell into stunned silence. Even the air felt heavier. Students leaned forward, their earlier smirks wiped clean as they watched the quiet kid in the hoodie dismantle a problem that would stump a graduate student. Halfway through, Marcus paused and glanced over his shoulder. "Do you want the solution expressed in exponentials or in terms of sine and cosine?" Stokes didn't answer. Her face had tightened, but she nodded once. Marcus kept going. He underlined the answer, set down the chalk, and returned to his seat. The silence was thick. Stokes walked to the board, scanning each line, hunting, hoping for a flaw. She found none. "You skipped a step," she said stiffly. Marcus lifted an eyebrow. "No, I didn't." Stokes pointed. "Here." Marcus nodded. "The partial fraction decomposition? I did it mentally, but I can write it out if you'd prefer." The way he said it, not smug, not defensive, just matter of fact, made her pause. "No, that won't be necessary," she said, her voice clipped. Marcus sat back. The room was no longer just impressed, they were captivated. But Marcus knew. Dr. Helen Stokes was just getting started. The next class session opened with tension you could cut with a scalpel. Students trickled in with an unusual hush, whispering in tight circles and casting glances toward Marcus. The buzz from the last lecture hadn't died, it had amplified. Whispers of, "The math kid," and, "Did you see him correct Dr. Stokes?" spread through lecture halls and dorm lounges like wildfire. But Marcus didn't bask in the attention. He wore the same hoodie, same calm demeanor, sat in his usual chair, eyes forward, pencil tapping rhythmically on his notebook, like it was just another day. But it wasn't. Dr. Helen Stokes entered later than usual, carrying a manila folder under one arm and a coffee that she didn't sip. Her movements were precise, but there was a stiffness in her posture that hadn't been there before. When she reached the podium, she didn't go straight to the lecture. Instead, she scanned the room until her eyes landed on Marcus. "We have an announcement," she said, her voice cool and clipped. "The university has been invited to participate in this year's Collegiate Mathematics Symposium, an elite academic competition where the region's top students compete in real time, solving problems under timed pressure." A few heads perked up. The symposium was no joke. It was where reputations were made and unmade. Most students never even dreamed of getting the chance. "I've submitted the name of our top candidate," she continued, her gaze never leaving Marcus. "Mr. Wynn, I assume you're up for it?" The silence that followed was electric. Marcus stared at her for a moment. He knew exactly what this was. Not an opportunity, a gauntlet. She had seen the class slip from her control, had felt the authority shift, and now she was grabbing for it back with both hands. He could have declined, it wasn't required, but if he walked away now, it would give her exactly what she wanted. A narrative that he was talented, sure, but not consistent, not disciplined. Not the kind of brilliance you could depend on under pressure. "I'm in," Marcus said calmly. Stokes gave a tight-lipped smile. "Excellent. Let's hope that spark you showed last week isn't a fluke." After class, Brian found him at the library, dropping a protein bar on the table and plopping into the seat across from him. "Dude," he said, "that wasn't an invitation. That was a trap." Marcus nodded. "I know." She's pissed. You embarrassed her in front of the class. This, Brian motioned in the air, this is her way of putting you in your place. Which means I have to win, Marcus said simply. Brian laughed dryly. Of course you do. The next 4 weeks were a blur of numbers and variables, of scratch paper stacked like snowdrifts and highlighters bleeding into the margins of textbooks. Marcus transformed a corner of the library into a personal war room, equations scrawled across whiteboards, pages tacked to the corkboard behind him, problem sets scattered across the table. He slept less, ate less, but he wasn't just training his brain, he was sharpening a weapon. Every night, Stokes' voice echoed in his head. The condescension, the way she had tried to trap him, not with incorrect math, but with pride, with spectacle. She wanted him to crumble. He refused to give her the satisfaction. Word spread fast. Other students began showing up to watch him solve problems during breaks, tossing him challenges, trying to stump him. They never did. Brian called it Math Club Underground. Marcus called it preparation. The night before the competition, Marcus sat alone in the quietest wing of the library, staring out the window at the snow dusting the campus green. He didn't feel ready. Not because he wasn't capable, but because he knew what was riding on this. Not just his reputation, but the perceptions of every student who had been talked down to, shut down, or underestimated by someone like Helen Stokes. This wasn't just math anymore. This was about power, narrative, truth. At dawn, he boarded the university shuttle bound for Philadelphia. The symposium was being held at Penn's elite mathematics department, a vaulted building of glass and steel humming with academic prestige. He wore the same hoodie, same jeans, no polished speech, just a battered notebook in his bag and a fire in his chest. The auditorium was packed, rows of students, professors, and judges. Stokes was there too, sitting in the third row, perfectly still, her expression unreadable. Marcus took his seat among the competitors, most of them older, many of them already in graduate school. One, a PhD candidate from Caltech named Brandon Lynn, sat directly across from him. Lynn barely glanced at Marcus until the first round results were posted, and Marcus was at the top. Mental math, theoretical application, speed solving, round after round, Marcus didn't just hold his own, he soared. His fingers moved like lightning, his logic was surgical. Even when he finished first, he stayed in his seat. Head down, no gloating, just focus. But Stokes watched every round, closely, and though she said nothing, her knuckles turned white where they gripped the program in her lap. Marcus had just entered the final stage of a battle she never expected him to win. The final round of the Collegiate Mathematics Symposium was designed not just to challenge intellect, but to fracture it. The kind of problem projected onto the auditorium screen wasn't something students solved. They survived it. Complex, layered integrals, embedded within matrix functions and theoretical transformations, it looked like a puzzle made to break even the most seasoned scholars. The timer above the stage began its silent countdown. 45 minutes. The room fell into an almost reverent hush. Marcus Wynn took a deep breath, eyes locked on the problem. He wasn't rattled. He didn't fidget. He didn't whisper like some of the others did, rehearsing steps under their breath. He simply stared, unblinking, letting the chaos of numbers settle into structure. This wasn't a problem to him. It was music. It had rhythm, harmony, dissonance, and somewhere in it, resolution. To his right, Brandon Lynn, the PhD student from Caltech with a perfect competition record, had already started scribbling furiously. His pen danced with practiced speed, attacking the equation like a man determined to dominate. Around them, the other finalists moved at varying paces, some visibly sweating, others frozen entirely. But Marcus didn't rush. He began writing only when the path forward had crystallized. In the audience, Dr. Helen Stokes sat motionless, her gaze fixed on Marcus. She wasn't smiling. Her folded arms betrayed nothing, but her eyes, sharp, observant, calculating, tracked every movement of his pen. She had once wielded authority like a sword, slicing through academic arrogance with her own. Now, that sword trembled. What she saw on that stage was no longer a student to correct or contain. It was something she couldn't control. Marcus's work unfolded with surgical precision. Where others double-checked each derivation, he flowed. His left hand stabilized the notebook, his right hand sketching symbols like calligraphy. 20 minutes in, he paused, not from confusion, but clarity. He saw it. The shortcut. A pattern embedded deep in the chaos. A symmetry in the nested functions that bypassed the brute force method everyone else was trudging through. He glanced left. Brandon was deep in a complex side calculation. Marcus nodded once to himself, picked up speed, and pivoted his strategy. By minute 35, a murmur rippled through the audience. Judges were leaning forward. The screen tracking competitors' inputs had Marcus nearing completion, while Brandon was only halfway through. The leaderboard still showed only previous round scores, but tension buzzed in the air. Stokes exhaled through her nose, one knee bouncing faintly. She had thrown Marcus into this fire expecting to prove a point. Instead, she watched him forge something unstoppable in it. Marcus boxed his final answer at minute 39. He placed his pen down. And then, only then, he looked up, meeting Dr. Stokes's gaze directly for the first time since the challenge began. She didn't look away. The final 6 minutes ticked by like a drumbeat. Brandon scribbled until the last second, submitting with a tight jaw and flaring nostrils. He glanced at Marcus, his first real acknowledgement of the freshman who had somehow outpaced him. No smirk, no words, just a look of dawning realization. The head judge, a soft-spoken mathematician from Yale, stood up and approached the stage. He carried 2 sets of papers, studied both answers, and cross-checked them with the solution model. The silence in the auditorium was thick, every breath held like glass. Finally, the judge stepped to the microphone. After careful review, we have our winner, representing the University of Michigan, Marcus Wynn. The room erupted. Cheers, whistles, a few stunned gasps. Brian jumped to his feet somewhere in the middle rows, fist pumping so hard he nearly knocked over the person beside him. Marcus didn't move at first. He just sat there, hands folded, breathing slowly. It wasn't disbelief, it was control. He wasn't shocked. He was ready. As the applause swelled, he stood, walked calmly to the stage and accepted the small engraved trophy with a quiet nod. Cameras flashed. Professors offered polite congratulations. Brandon Lynn gave him a brief handshake. No bitterness, only respect. In the third row, Dr. Stokes remained seated. She clapped. Once, twice, then stopped. Their eyes met again, and for the first time her face softened. Not into a smile, but something close. A conceding nod. Not of approval, of acknowledgement. A silent understanding that whatever line she thought separated professors from prodigies had been permanently erased. Later, after the crowd had thinned, Marcus stood outside the auditorium steps, watching snowflakes fall under the amber glow of streetlights. Brian came jogging up, wide grin on his face. "You freaking did it, man." Marcus just smiled faintly. "She's never going to look at me the same." Brian elbowed him. "Forget her. No one's going to look at you the same." Marcus glanced up at the building behind him, eyes sharp. Good. Because he hadn't just won a competition. He'd changed the conversation. The morning after the symposium, the energy on campus was different. The usually sleepy corridors of the mathematics department buzzed with conversation. Students who had never spoken to Marcus Wynn were suddenly nodding at him in the halls, whispering his name with a mixture of curiosity and awe. His win had traveled faster than the sunrise, circulating through social media posts, university group chats, and even a mention on the university's homepage. "Freshman Prodigy defeats PhD at Regional Symposium," the headline read. But Marcus wasn't caught up in the spotlight. He walked to class with the same quiet stride, hoodie pulled up, earbuds in, letting the noise swirl around him without letting it in. When he stepped into Dr. Helen Stokes' lecture hall, he could feel the shift. Heads turned. A few students offered him seats that had once been reserved for the favorites. Brian was already there, leaning back in his chair, grinning like a proud older brother. "I heard they're calling you the Michigan Mind," he whispered. Marcus shook his head, sliding into his usual seat. "That's ridiculous. You did crush a guy with a doctorate. Let them talk." He didn't respond, not because he didn't care, but because he was still processing it all. The night before had been a blur of handshakes, congratulations, and unfamiliar praise. But what stuck with him most wasn't the applause or the trophy. It was the silence that followed. The moment when it was just him and the problem, when everything else fell away and he was left alone with the numbers. That's where he felt most alive. Dr. Stokes entered the room a minute later, exactly on time as always. The room quieted. She set her briefcase down, smoothed her blazer, and turned to face the class. Her expression was unreadable, but something in her eyes had shifted. "Before we begin," she said, her voice even but laced with weight, "I'd like to take a moment to recognize Marcus Wynn." A pause. She continued, "Yesterday, Marcus represented our university at the Collegiate Mathematics Symposium. Not only did he perform exceptionally, he earned first place against some of the most advanced minds in the country. That achievement speaks not just to talent, but to discipline, poise, and a rare kind of mathematical insight." The class clapped, some enthusiastically, others with quiet respect. Brian gave a loud whoop that made a few students chuckle. Stokes allowed the applause to settle before adding, "It's not easy to rise to a challenge, especially one you didn't ask for. Marcus did, and he succeeded." Her gaze found his, and for the first time, there was no condescension, no test, no walls, just honesty. If anyone here still believes brilliance only comes in a certain package, think again. With that, she turned to the board and began her lecture, but the atmosphere was different. The room wasn't hers anymore, not entirely. A new kind of gravity had entered the space, and it centered around Marcus. As the lecture continued, Marcus scribbled quietly in his notebook, the numbers flowing just as easily as before. But now, there was something extra behind each equation. Confidence, momentum, and something he had never expected to gain. Not from Stokes, and not from anyone in that room. Respect. That evening, Marcus sat alone at a corner table in the campus library, a worn notebook open in front of him, filled with scribbled equations and half-finished thoughts. The world outside the tall windows was painted in hues of amber and fading blue, the sun dipping low behind the bell tower. Students passed by in groups, laughing, some throwing glances his way. But Marcus wasn't basking in the spotlight. He was grounding himself in the numbers, the calm logic that had always been his sanctuary. The symposium trophy sat in his backpack, untouched since the ceremony, not because it meant nothing, but because what truly mattered couldn't be etched into metal. As he traced over a new problem, one he wasn't required to solve, the door creaked open. Footsteps approached. He looked up to see Dr. Stokes standing beside the table, holding something in her hand, a crisp, white envelope. "May I?" she asked. He nodded, surprised but composed. She handed him the envelope and sat across from him. "The department is nominating you for the National Undergraduate Fellowship. It's early, but after what you did, the committee agreed unanimously." Marcus blinked. I didn't even know I was being considered." "You weren't," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Until you forced us to see you." There was no bitterness in her voice now, only admiration, quiet and sincere. She stood, smoothing her blazer. "You redefined what brilliance looks like, Marcus, not just in your answers, but in your silence, your focus, your refusal to shrink." She hesitated, then added, "You didn't just outsolve a problem, you changed the narrative." As she turned to leave, Marcus opened the envelope. Inside was a formal letter, confirming the nomination and inviting him to apply. But beneath the official language, it was something else. A signal that the tides had shifted. That maybe, just maybe, the world was starting to recognize brilliance in places it had too long overlooked. Marcus leaned back, the weight of the day settling in his chest, not heavy, but full, of pride, of possibility, of the quiet certainty that he hadn't just passed a test, he had rewritten the rules of what people thought someone like him could do. And he was just getting started. This story isn't just about numbers or equations. It's about breaking barriers, defying expectations, and rising with quiet confidence when the world underestimates you. Marcus didn't ask for recognition. He earned it, step by deliberate step, proving that true brilliance doesn't always wear a spotlight. In today's world where talent often gets overshadowed by noise or bias, stories like this remind us of the quiet power of persistence and integrity. Whether in a classroom, boardroom, or everyday life, there will always be moments when you're tested, not just in skill, but in courage. When that moment comes, may we all choose to rise like Marcus. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected places.